Welcome to once again to my revisitation of MERP, the Iron Crown Enterprises, a Middle Earth role-playing system. Hey, if you guys like this stuff, tag it, tell your friends, scream at me, make comments. If you don't like it, you don't like it. There's a bunch of crap going on in the with YouTube these days about monetization and other things. I mean, I have no illusions that I was never going to make a buck doing this. This isn't about that. This is about bringing interest back to certain aspects of the older school gaming systems that abound. There's so many of these game systems out there that just screaming to be played. They're still playable. They're great things, and there's no, and I get it. The next great best thing comes along every year. Every couple of years, somebody has to rehash a brand new, an old system, or brings out new stuff, and everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. That's fine, but you know what? There's a whole slew of generations out there that have not played any of this old stuff, and the old stuff's good stuff. And it's out there, and it's easy to get, fairly easy to get, reasonably inexpensive, although I will grant you that this particular game system is becoming more and more expensive to get the older material, in part because, there's every, year there's a little less of it floating around. But if you can get it, even if you can only get a few bits and pieces of it, is playable. And if nothing else, if you're a fan of Tolkien's world, of the Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, this is awesome material for reading, for backstory. Because I've read this stuff over and over and over again in my lifetime, I'm able to picture those settings far better in the novels before I ever saw the movies. And I can see much wider ranging things going on and the backstory and the history and the world, and I understand that what's going on the screen is just a small bit piece of a much bigger picture. So, many values for having. This particular one is Ents of Fangorn. Now, you may or may not see a little bit of rough usage. This is one of those source books that I really enjoy reading over and over again because there's a lot of good material in here. For the most part, aside from dealing with some bandits, and it's got a handful of adventures back here. You're dealing with some bandits in one, and one of the outlying orc holds in another one. The orcs from the Moria, or from southern Misty Mountains near Moria. For the most part, though, you were dealing with locations within the forest and the Ents themselves. And as regions go, as areas go, it's a good place. It's a nice place to have a set of adventures, and yet it's a very tricky place to have a set of adventures because it's not your atypical locale, if you will. For starters, the Ents and the Herons populate this forest, and they're guardians of their forest, and they're very perceptive, and they will protect the trees. And inadvertently will protect them by murdering the party if necessary, and not think twice about it, mostly because they may not even notice any difference between the party and the bandits, or the party and some orcs. It's because they live in their own universe, so to speak, the Ents do. And the Hurons don't care what you are. If you're if you're walking around on two legs, you're potential fertilizer, and that's all they, for the most part, think about. So you make the mistake of walking into one of their dark groves deep in the forest, you're probably not walking back out. Just something to keep in mind. On the other side of that, what you don't see in Fangorn, and it doesn't, it mentions the fauna that also live in the woods. You got a lot of flora, but you also got some fauna. But you don't see a lot of the predatorial ones. There's the cougars and the wolves and the bears, in part because they don't like to be around the Ents. The Hurons will turn them into fertilizer just as fast as they'll turn a human into a fertilizer. It's the nature of the forest. It's a pretty deadly and dangerous place for those that are not very wary. The forest itself butts up against the southern Misty Mountains, with Isengard at the far end, anchored by Isengard at one end, and the approaches to Moria and Lothlorien to the north. There's a spur of the mountains that kind of divide it a little bit to keep some border there, so to speak. But there's an unspoken area where the other races don't go. There's an edge to the forest where the Ents don't generally go past, and the elves and orcs and stuff to the north have a tendency to avoid coming south of that area because they usually don't come back. The elves may, but the orcs definitely won't. The Rohirrim that control and oversee the plains to the east. Well, once again, they tend to ignore the forest in general by not going in it. They will mess around with the edges of it. They have no qualms about cutting some trees down and using the firewood and stuff. But since the Rohirrim themselves are not adamantly urban dwellers, they don't harvest the forest. That means there's no money or profit to be made in lumbering because, well, for starters, they wouldn't last very long. The Ents would put a stop to it in a hurry. Second, there just isn't a market for it. Not to make it profitable to ship to Gondor or take it across the plains. It's just not going to happen. So it's remote enough of an area that a lot of legend and myth exist. At the same time, it can be part of a crossroad. Lots of people skirt around the edges of it on their way. People traveling through the Gap of Rohan, heading north, heading south. People heading up and down the Great River tend to stick to those areas and not venture into the heart of the woods. There's no reason to, and there's nothing there. Now, the exceptions is that there's the Tyr Limelight, for example. There's an elvish myth of a number of stories that go along in that, and it's a legitimate place. There's an elvish maiden still living in the Tyr Limelight that's been there for a long, long time. And other than a few Ents and a handful of very, very rare elves that come visit, most people don't know she exists. Then, like I said, then there's the orcs and the occasional goblins and a few bad creatures that you run across. But for the most part, they skirt the edges of Fangorn. Now, if you want encounters with the Ents themselves, well, that's basically what the first half of the source book's for. It gives you a lot of detailed information on their habits, their lifestyles, their homes, how they deal with things, their views on the world per se. If you've seen the movies, you know one of these boys. You get one of these boys upset at you. You've got your hands full because they are one bad set of hombres when they're ticked off. It takes a lot to tick them off, which is a good thing. This is why they don't go around conquering neighboring woodlands, I guess. The fact that there aren't any. Goes into Ents, the brief history, culture and social structure, magic, Ent drots, daily life. Gives you actually some details of the herb drought, the nut drought, and the fruit drought. Explains in better detail why Pippin and Merry actually grew several inches and gained some poundage after their brief visit with Fangorn, with Treebeard himself. The land, the climate, the flora. Goes into some detail about some of the plants and animals that you can find in here, mostly plants, fauna. She says here, animals in these areas are very numerous, but the size of the area in which they live causes them to be scarce when the object is to locate them, i.e. you're hunting for food. Of course, the most numerous groups of these animals are those that are domestic. These domestic animals are sheep, goats, and cattle. Several herds of wild kind have been tamed, blah, blah, blah. So, give you some detail on that. Grass cats, the green asps. Treebeard, the inhabitants, skin, bark, leaf, loft. They'll give you the stats for both Romaster and Middle Earth. Merp for the three main elder Ents, if you will. Then we've got the Hurons. The Hurons are tree spirits, as they are sometimes called, their unknown origin. Several theories have been put forth to explain their beginnings. One states that they are Ents that have lost track of the cultural heritage and become dormant, but not completely. Other states that they are trees that have become entish, as it were. The possible explanation of why a tree might become an ent-like was given by Ragast the Brown in a discussion of the topic with an elf of Mirkwood. It is possible one can imagine Ents reproduce much like plants that they resemble. If this were the case, then it might also be possible that Ent could cross-pollinate passively with a tree that is similar to it in structure to produce half-Ents. These half-Ents or Hurons would then grow into maturity and would resemble trees even more than the Ents do, so much so that only an Ent would they appear different? To an untrained eye, they would just be trees. Trees that can murder you, whether you're asleep or not. And they can move, right? That's, I believe, based on some of Mary's stories of the old forest on the edge of the Brandywine up there in Brooklyn, that the trees move. So I think there's a group of Hurons that live in the woods there, and I think the old man Willow potentially is either Huron or maybe he is an Ent that's gone treesh. Just to be, just saying. Then we talked with Tolan. Tolan's the young lady, the young Cinder woman captured by the Sergeant and Margot taking in the thing. Her name was Tolan, but there's blah 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 blah. And lady's been hiding out in the woods for a long, long time. Fangorn during this year, Fangorn after this year, inhabitants, politics and the power of the borders, the cardinal horns. This particular setting was set before Rohan became a country per se, so the lands of Rohan are under the sway of Gondor at the time. The Sylvian elves, the orcs, the borders, and we got nice places of note, the Durdingle, Welling Hall, pictures of what Fangorn, Treebird's home looked like when he took the hobbits to the Durdingle, where they all had the big moot and got together and decided they were going to go kick Sir-Man's butt. Good stuff. Good information. Nice supplement to have. Something to consider